Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Gage Harlan. Long before the word Outbreak was on every screen, I was just a weekday commuter and a weekend hunter. I lived on the fringe of the sprawl, close enough to catch the city's orange haze on the clouds at night, but far enough out that I could hit open dirt before the coffee in my travel mug cooled down. Weekdays meant clean jeans, brake lights, and fixing problems for people who couldn't fix them themselves. That paycheck covered the mortgage, the deer tags, and the diesel. My real life didn't start until Fridays, the second I pointed my truck toward the county line and watched the skyline shrink in the rearview mirror. Out there, the concrete gave way to black dirt, hedgerows, and blocks of timber. Sagging barns rotted into the weeds, and silver grain bins stood like sentries at the end of gravel lanes. I had a lease on a few hundred acres, enough ground to hang trail cams, read tracks in the mud, and map out exactly where the bucks crossed the fence when the north wind cut through. My favorite spot was a custom deer stand I'd welded and bolted together over 2 seasons. It wasn't some flimsy store-bought blind. I built it on 4 heavy steel legs with 20 feet of ladder and an oversized plywood cabin. I made it double wide, thinking I'd take my nephews out one day, so there was actually enough floor space for 2 or 3 people to stretch out if they had to. It sat tucked into a line of oaks between the corn and the creek, covering a perfect funnel from feed to cover. Most guys I knew chased their weekends at sports bars or stadiums. I chased mine by climbing that ladder in the pitch black, settling into the cold, and listening to the world wake up beneath me while the city kept rushing nowhere without me. The shift didn't start with a breaking news banner or an emergency broadcast. It started in the gridlock. The morning commute into the city, usually just a headache, turned into a gauntlet of noise. Sirens became the background track to every drive. At first, it was just one extra ambulance weaving through traffic or a pair of cruisers blowing red lights, the kind of thing you notice for a second and then forget. But within days, it became standard to see strobing lights in 3 different directions before I even cleared the beltway. At the office, the break room chatter stopped being about football scores and shifted to road rage and freak accidents. Everyone knew someone who had seen something ugly on the way in. A delivery guy mentioned seeing a dude on the sidewalk go for a stranger's throat in broad daylight, taking a tire iron to the ribs and not even flinching. A nurse who lived in our complex told my coworker that her ER was overflowing with bite wounds and assault cases, and they were hemorrhaging staff who were too scared to come in. What bothered me wasn't the stories themselves. It was the look in people's eyes when they told them. The kind of folks who usually laughed everything off were suddenly walking to the parking garage with their keys protruding from their knuckles like brass knuckles. The rent-a-cops in the lobby who used to sit there scrolling TikTok were now standing up, watching the revolving doors like they expected a breach. Out in the county where I hunted, the change showed up differently. That fall, the woods started feeling wrong. I began finding kills that didn't match any predator I knew. I found a doe shredded in the back corner of a bean field, torn open from the neck down like something had tried to eat the whole thing at once and then got bored halfway through. Coyotes and scavengers are efficient. They take what they can carry and strip the bones. They don't leave 50 pounds of meat rotting on the ground. A few days later, a yearling buck turned up dead near the creek. Both front legs were snapped and twisted underneath it. The mud around the carcass was churned up from a struggle, hooves dug deep, bark scraped off the nearby saplings. But there was no bullet hole, no arrow wound, and no grill marks or shattered plastic from a vehicle impact. Something had run it down on foot and taken massive chunks out of the shoulders and face. The spine looked chewed through, not cut. Farmers at the local co-op started grumbling about gates left unlatched that no one remembered touching. A neighbor swore his prize heifer had gone insane in the middle of the night, slamming herself against the barn boards until her neck snapped. When he went out with a flashlight to check, he said he found bloody smears on the fence posts, but they were high up, near the top wire. It looked like hands, not hooves, had grabbed the wood for leverage. My trail cams along the creek revealed more problems. At first, it was just the deer population acting spooky, bunched tight in open spots where they usually spread out. Then one SD card captured a coyote standing dead center of the trail at high noon. Its ribs were showing, foam dripped from its jowls, and it was staring straight into the lens with a look that wasn't fear or hunger. In the next frame, it was gone. No motion blur, no tail leaving the frame, just empty trail and a timestamp only 2 seconds later. That kind of speed wasn't natural. On a Saturday morning sit, the sound of gunfire rolled in from a section of woods where nobody had permission to hunt. It wasn't the slow, patient crack of a deer rifle. It was a string of fast pops, a pistol mag dump, followed by a pause and then another rapid volley. The sound drifted from down near the county road, carrying across the cut corn. After the shots died out, the woods went silent in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. No birds calling, no squirrels barking, just the wind pushing through dry stalks. I climbed down early and drove the gravel loop past the far side of the property. A state trooper's Charger sat sideways across the road with both doors wide open. No officer stood by it. No flares, no caution tape, just empty ditches and a long, dark skid mark where someone had locked up their brakes coming around the blind curve. Half a mile farther, an old sedan lay nose down in the ditch with all 4 doors hanging open and the radio still playing something tinny I couldn't make out from the road. The radio stations in my truck shifted tone that same week. They still played ads and music, but the breaks between songs started carrying heavy rotation of emergency messages. At first, it was generic reminders about staying calm and avoiding large crowds due to unspecified civil unrest. Then they started naming specific districts and telling people to bypass certain highway exits because of ongoing police operations. No one used the word plague or virus yet. They just talked about violent clusters, overloaded hospitals, and temporary shelter locations. From the city, it looked like another bad stretch of riots or crime. But out here in the fields and tree lines, it felt different. Prey animals were jumpy in the wrong places and too calm in others. The farm dogs barked themselves hoarse through the night and then went silent all at once. Those nights in the stand, which used to feel like an escape from the world, started to feel like I was waiting for something I couldn't name yet, and it was getting closer. By the time the leaves started to turn, the city didn't just feel wrong, it felt terminal. It didn't happen overnight. One week, the sirens were just a nuisance, louder and more frequent than usual. By the next week, the wail never stopped. It became a constant dissonant background track to everything we did. At the office, the water cooler talk shifted from football spreads to freak accidents and road rage incidents. HR sent out a mass email about working remotely out of an abundance of caution and avoiding dense urban centers. Security chained the side exits and funneled everyone through the main lobby. No one said why, but everyone had a story. A cousin jumped by a stranger in a Walmart parking lot. A city bus driver bitten by a passenger who had to be tased 3 times before he let go. On my lunch break, I walked to the corner bodega. The windows were cross-taped with handwritten cardboard signs limiting water, canned goods, and batteries. Inside, it was organized chaos. Carts jammed the narrow aisles. People stared at the empty shelves and their phones with the same desperate look, hoping one or the other would save them. The cashier was a kid I'd seen 100 times, but today his hands shook so bad he kept dropping coins every time a customer raised their voice. The radio on the drive home stopped playing music entirely. The DJs were replaced by breathless bulletins telling people to avoid specific highway interchanges and to steer clear of downtown. They used sanitized phrases like violent clusters and containment protocols. It was just a polite way of saying the police were outnumbered and losing ground. That night, my phone buzzed nonstop with shared videos. One grainy clip showed a man in a parking garage bleeding from both arms while 3 security guards tried to pin him down. He bucked and twisted with a mechanical strength that didn't match his build. Someone off-screen yelled that they'd already hit him with a lead pipe. The guy didn't even blink. He just kept snapping his jaws at the air. The next morning, the freeway into town looked like a salvage yard. Cars sat sideways across 3 lanes with doors hanging open. A FedEx truck had buried its nose deep into the concrete median. A sedan in front of me tried to snake through the gap, clipped an SUV and spun into the Jersey barrier. The driver stumbled out, clutching his shoulder. Before he could even assess the damage, a man sprinted from the breakdown lane, not running for help, but running like a linebacker. He slammed the driver into the hood. There was no demand for a wallet, no shouting, just a tackle and the wet tear of teeth on throat. Other drivers jumped out to help, thinking it was a fight. When they grabbed the attacker, he whipped his head around and snapped at them, his eyes glassy and void of anything human. They dragged him off by sheer numbers, kicking and screaming. I didn't wait to see the end. I threw the truck into reverse, backed down the on-ramp, and left the freeway behind. Whatever this was, bath salts, rabies, or something worse, I wasn't going to sit in a steel cage waiting for my turn. Back at my apartment complex, the manager was sliding notices under the doors. One sheet talked about shelter-in-place orders, advising us to stay inside while the situation stabilized. Another listed which pharmacies were still operational. In the hallway, neighbors were already arguing. Some claimed it was media hype. Others wanted to barricade the lobby with sofas. I shut my door, locked the deadbolt, and realized that staying here was just choosing a slower coffin. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the local paper. The city's advice was to wait and hope. My instincts screamed that the longer I stayed, the more I was betting my life on the decision-making skills of panic-stricken strangers. That hadn't worked out great so far. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and made a list. Rifle, shotgun, pistol, ammo cans, hunting pack, broken-in boots, cold weather layers, tools, trauma kit, stove fuel, rice, beans, water bricks, tarps, and paracord. I made a second column for the maybe pile and then ruthlessly crossed out anything that was just comfort. Furniture, photos, most of my civilian clothes, anything that needed a wall outlet, it all stayed. Sirens wailed again, close enough that the window glass hummed in the frame. I killed the lights and started packing. I emptied drawers into duffels and hard cases. Every time I dropped something into the stay pile, I treated it like a goodbye. I wasn't coming back for the TV. Before sunrise, I carried the first load down to the truck. The lot was half awake and tense. One guy 3 spots over was loading his SUV the same way I was, stacking boxes and strapping a dog crate into the back. We caught each other's eye. No words, just a quick, grim nod. The universal sign for, I'm getting out. On the way out of town, I hit a police checkpoint. 2 cruisers, a fire truck, cones, and officers waving cars through one at a time. When it was my turn, a trooper with dark circles under his eyes looked in the bed of my truck, saw the gun cases and the jerry cans, and leaned in. I kept my hands on the wheel and said, I'm heading out to family land in the county, just going to ride this out away from the crowds. He studied me for a long second, looking past me at the skyline, then tapped the roof of my truck and said, Good. If you can stay out, stay out. There's nothing back there you want to see. He waved me through. Past the last strip mall, the traffic finally thinned. By the time the highway dropped to 2 lanes, I could hold a steady speed. The orange glow of the city faded in the mirrors. The smell through the vents changed from exhaust and burning rubber to cut cornstalks and cold dirt. I turned onto the gravel road that led toward my hunting ground. I knew every bend, every washout. The farmhouses along the way were shut tight, curtains drawn, porch lights off. A cattle gate that was always chained now hung wide open. One driveway showed deep, fresh ruts in the mud like someone had peeled out fast and hadn't come back. When I parked at the edge of the property where my stand sat, the sun was just getting high enough to light the creek bottom. I killed the engine and sat for a second with my hands gripping the wheel. No sirens, no horns, no screaming. Just the wind rattling the stubble and a dog barking somewhere over the rise. Whatever this world was turning into, I was going to face it from 20 feet up, not from an apartment hallway with a paper notice taped to the door. I tucked the truck tight against the hedgerow and killed the engine. The silence hit harder than the noise had. After days of sirens and screaming tires, the quiet out here felt heavy. There was just the wind rattling the dry corn stalks and the ticking of cooling metal under the hood. It was the same pull-off I'd used every season, but the bed piled high with gun cases, duffels, and jerry cans made it clear this wasn't a weekend trip. I wasn't here to fill a tag and rush back to the office on Monday. I was here because this field was the only place left where I trusted the ground I stood on. My stand sat just inside the strip of oaks 20 feet up on 4 heavy steel legs with the ladder facing away from the road. From the lane, it looked like a standard box on stilts, nothing worth a second glance. But up close you could see the reinforcements, new bolts, patched screw holes, and marine paint rolled thick over the rust. I had built the cabin oversized, intending to spend long, freezing days inside. I wanted room to stretch out. Tonight, that extra square footage made it the safest place I had. I skipped the usual mowed path and cut wide through the corn stubble instead. There was no point in leaving a straight, beaten line from the road to my hideout if scared people, or worse, started walking the fence lines. I hooked my path twice, walking in erratic loops to break up the trail, and made 3 trips. First haul was rifles and ammo cans. Second was the heavy food and water bricks. Third was clothes, my sleeping bag, and a hard case with a lantern, radio, and tools. Everything else stayed locked in the truck until I knew if I'd survived the first night. At the base of the ladder, I stopped and wind-checked the area. The oaks rustled in a steady rush. No engines on the gravel, no voices, no distant cracks of gunfire. Somewhere down by the creek bottom, a farm dog barked once, sharp and angry, and then cut off mid-yelp. Nothing answered. For the moment, this patch of dirt was as calm as it was ever going to be. I gripped the cold steel rails and started to climb. Inside, the stand was bare but familiar. Plywood walls, a wide shelf, heavy hooks for gear, and enough floor space to lay out a sleeping bag without kicking the heater. It smelled like dust, gun oil, and old coffee. I set the rifle in the front corner, leaned the shotgun next to it, and kept the pistol on my belt. My sleeping bag went against the back wall, tight into the corner, and I dropped my pack on top of it with the radio and fresh batteries ready. Most of the dial was dead air. A few stations were broadcasting a looped message telling people to shelter in place and wait for instructions that weren't coming. One live voice was reading highway numbers in a monotone, warning listeners to avoid main routes due to ongoing mass casualty incidents. No one said outbreak yet, but the wrecked cars and blood-streaked pavement I'd passed said it for them. Full dark had been set for maybe an hour when the floor under my boots started to vibrate. At first, I blamed the wind, but the pattern tightened into a rhythmic thumping beat that climbed the steel legs. Fast steps on dirt and gravel, more than one person, all of them moving hard. I slid the lantern into my pack to kill the glow and sat with my back pressed against the plywood, letting my eyes adjust to the thin starlight through the window. Through the front glass, I watched the tree line where the narrow lane cut toward the county road. Shapes peeled away from the shadows of the trunks. 1, then 3, then more, sprinting. Shoulders low, arms pumping, heads pushed forward like hounds locked on a scent. One hit a tractor rut, went down hard, rolled, and snapped back to its feet without missing a beat. No clutching the knee, no limp, just back to top speed over rough ground in the dark. Headlights slashed across the trees, bouncing with every dip in the road. A sedan tore along the gravel, way too fast for the blind curve by my field entrance. The rear end stepped out, the car slid sideways, and a wheel dropped into the ditch with a sickening crunch. The engine screamed as the driver tried to claw back onto the lane, spinning tires in the mud. A door flew open and a man bailed out, stumbling, then scrambling along the fence line. The running shapes turned the second the lights swept over them, cutting straight toward the sound of the revving engine and the panicked breathing. From my stand 50 yards back, I watched the lead runner close the gap in seconds. It hit the man high, a flying tackle that took them both off their feet and into the weeds. The man screamed once, sharp, clear, and terrified. Then the rest of the pack piled on. Limbs moved in short, violent bursts. Heads dipped and rose in a rhythm that looked less like a fight and more like feeding. Normal people don't move with that kind of kinetic energy. They don't bounce up from falls like rubber, and they don't ignore a crashing car to get to fresh meat first. My hand drifted toward the rifle and hovered there. A shot into that writhing heap wouldn't save him. It would just be a dinner bell for everything within a mile, telling them there was another living target sitting in a box above the field. I stayed frozen back against the wall, counting my breaths while the mass in the ditch thrashed and finally went still. Two of the shapes straightened up, slick with dark stains, and turned toward the trees that hid my stand. For a long, agonizing second, they faced my direction, and every muscle in my body locked. Nothing moved. The ladder didn't shake. No hand slapped the metal. The box stayed dark, the heater cold, the window just another black square in the canopy. Whatever sense they used, it didn't lock onto me. They peeled away, angling back toward the road, and broke into that same unnatural hard sprint. My hands started shaking only after they were gone. Whatever the radio called incidents had already turned these back roads into a hunting ground. This field wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was just open ground between me and things that could outrun me without even trying. The morning after I watched those things drag a man into the drainage ditch, I woke up feeling like I'd gone 10 rounds with a prize fighter. My back was locked tight and my neck wouldn't turn. The plywood floor was fine for a 3-hour sit during deer season, but after a full night it felt like I'd been sleeping on a pile of loose tools. I'd built this stand as a blind, not a bunker. But if I wanted to stay off the ground, I had to turn it into something a human being could actually survive in. The first tactical problem sat right underneath me. The permanent ladder ran straight from the dirt to the hatch. That had always been convenient for hunting. Now it was a dinner bell. Anyone walking the field or anything that moved with the terrifying speed of those things by the road could be inside my box in seconds. I unloaded the rifle, slung it tight across my back, and climbed down with a socket wrench in my pocket. I worked fast, adrenaline doing half the heavy lifting. I loosened the bolts on the bottom 2 sections, dropped the steel rungs into the stubble, and climbed back up the bare legs using friction and fear. I scanned the road and tree line constantly. By mid-morning, the stand sat on 4 smooth steel columns with no handholds at all. Getting to the hatch now required tools, not just an easy climb. 2 pressure-treated 2x4s from the truck bed became a removable ladder. I used short scraps for rungs and drove heavy screws to hold everything tight. I carried it back in a wide arc instead of walking straight from the lane, stepping in old tractor ruts to mask my trail. At the stand, I set it, climbed, and then hauled it up behind me with a paracord line tied to the top rung. With the ladder flat on the floor and the hatch bolted shut, the stand finally felt like it had a perimeter. Heat was the next priority. I had a small Mr. Buddy propane heater and a few green bottles, but that was a finite resource. Once the gas was gone, it was gone. Out here, fuel grew out of the ground. Physical labor, not a credit card, would keep me warm. An old cast-iron camp stove sat in a collapsed lean-to by the back fence, something I'd picked up at a yard sale years ago and never fired up. I walked the hedgerow with my head on a swivel, listening between steps. The stove was rusty, but the firebox was solid. I brought it back in 2 heavy trips. Inside the stand, I cleared the front corner and screwed a piece of scrap metal roofing to the floor as a heat shield. Another piece went on the wall behind it. The stove sat on the pad, anchored down. I pushed short lengths of stovepipe together into a stack, cut a hole in the roof just big enough for the exit, and packed the gap with fiberglass insulation and custom flashing so the plywood never saw direct heat. The first test fire was small, just dry twigs and cardboard. Smoke climbed the pipe and slipped out into the wind. The back wall warmed and the biting dampness left the air. I knew I had to be careful. Heavy smoke was a visual beacon. I'd have to burn dry, seasoned oak and keep the fires hot and small to minimize the plume. But if I fed it right, that iron box would keep us from freezing to death. Water was next on the list. The creek at the bottom of the property was still flowing, but hiking down into that hollow while fast movers roamed the woods was a suicide mission. I needed a source closer and higher than the banks. The roof was small, but it could still catch rain. I just had to guide it. I rigged a heavy-duty tarp between 2 oaks and one of the steel legs, creating a slope toward a low corner. A short run of salvaged gutter sat under the drip point. From the gutter, a piece of PVC pipe dropped into a blue 50-gallon plastic drum I strapped to the leg just under the platform. I'd poured concrete footings for these legs years ago, so I knew they could take the weight. I wrapped the barrel in an old sleeping bag and duct tape to keep it from freezing solid. Near the bottom, I installed a bulkhead fitting and a tap, then ran a hose up through a notch in the floor. It was a crude gravity-fed system. Rain hit the tarp, slid to the gutter, filled the barrel, and flowed into whatever jug I set under the hose. I'd still have to filter and boil every drop, and I'd have to bleed the hose line every night to keep the ice from bursting the valve. But it meant I didn't have to walk the creek bed for every drink. Space came after water. Until now, the stand had been a box for one chair and one hunter. With a stove in the corner, a hose through the floor, and gear stacked deep, it started to feel like the inside of a packed truck bed. Since I'd built the floor double wide, I had options, but I had to be smart. If I ended up sharing this space, we needed to be able to sleep without stepping on each other's throats. I drove heavy lag screws into every solid stud and went vertical. Packs, coats, spare clothes, and loose bags went on hooks instead of the floor. That cleared enough room for 2 narrow sleeping pads against the back and right walls. It wasn't the Ritz, but it beat fighting for a clean patch of plywood. For a third person, I installed a hammock. I drilled 2 heavy eye bolts into the strongest framing members at opposite corners. The hammock clipped between them, hanging diagonally over the center of the room. When not in use, it stayed rolled up on a hook. When needed, it deployed in 30 seconds. The last item on the list was the one no one likes to talk about in survival movies. You can't live in a box without a plan for biological waste. Climbing down the leg in the pitch dark every time nature called was a great way to end up dead at the base of the ladder. I built a bump-out privy, a narrow wooden box that hung off the downwind side of the platform, supported by heavy bracing. Plywood sides, a hinged lid, and a 5-gallon bucket under a cutout seat. From inside the stand, it was just a low door and a step down. From below, I camouflaged it with dark tarp and wired on oak branches to break up the silhouette. The bucket had a gasket-sealed lid. Emptying it would still mean a dangerous bucket run to a burial site far from the stand. But we could choose our moment when the coast was clear. By the time the light started to fade, my shoulders ached and my hands were raw blisters, but the stand felt different. It wasn't safe, nothing was anymore. But it now had a retractable ladder, a stove I could feed, a water catchment system, bunks for 3, and a way to handle the ugly parts of life without leaving the perimeter. It wasn't a house, but it was a hell of a lot better than sleeping on the ground. The first hard lesson about sound discipline came on a dead calm afternoon. The wind died down completely, the creaking of the oaks stopped, and for the first time in days I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. I was sitting on the floor with my back against the plywood, running a rag over the rifle bolt, when the steel legs picked up a faint, deliberate vibration. It wasn't the heavy, chaotic pounding of runners hitting the gravel. It was slower, careful, like someone testing the ground for twigs before committing their weight. I killed the stove immediately so the metal wouldn't tick as it cooled. The box lost its heat fast, but I needed absolute acoustic clarity. I slid to the front window, keeping my profile low, and scanned the cut corn, the stubble, the hedgerow, the dark line of the creek. Everything looked still. But the feeling in the metal frame persisted. A figure stepped out from behind a massive oak near the lane, moving one agonizingly slow step at a time. Its shoulders were rounded forward, its head tilted at a sharp angle like it was listening to the air itself. Its clothes hung in muddy strips, one arm dangling at a wrong angle, the hand spasming open and closed in a rhythm that had nothing to do with conscious thought. It turned in a slow, grinding half-circle, then walked straight toward the stand. From the ground, my box was just another dark lump in the canopy. The hatch was bolted, the ladder was pulled up. I held my breath and watched it close the distance. 10 yards. 5. Close enough that I could see dried, black blood caked around its mouth. It stopped directly under the frame, cocked its head, and stood there like a statue. When it moved again, it didn't wander aimlessly. It took 2 calculated steps, paused, shifted its weight without making a sound, and continued. It made a slow perimeter circle around the base of the legs, freezing every time the wind shifted or a bird fluttered in the branches above. It wasn't a mindless city shambler, and it wasn't a high-speed missile like the runner that had tackled the driver in the ditch. It was patient. A dry chip of paint peeled off the wall behind me and slid across the floor near my boot. The sound was microscopic. The thing below snapped its head up, locking its eyes on the floorboards directly under me like I'd dropped a wrench. A sudden noise down by the creek, a branch snapping under some animal's weight, broke its focus. It turned instantly, drifted toward the hollow, and slipped into the brush with the silence of a ghost. My pulse hammered in my throat long after it was gone. I had just met a new classification of infected, a stalker. Height and walls still mattered, but they weren't enough anymore. From that moment on, the stand had to be a void. Metal pots got felt pads glued to their bottoms. The ladder rope got wrapped in cloth so it wouldn't slap the wood. The lantern sat on a folded towel. When I added a stick to the stove, I waited for the wind to gust before I opened the door. 2 days of that silent routine shredded my nerves. I slept in 20-minute slices, waking at the slightest rustle, hand already on the pistol. The radio offered nothing but static and a looped recording about shelters that were probably burning by now. Our supplies, wood, water, food, were all dropping. Every chore on the list meant climbing down into the kill zone and trusting that nothing was waiting in the blind spot between the legs. I stood at the hatch with my hand on the locking bar, procrastinating, until a cloud of dust on the gravel lane forced a decision. A beat-up pickup truck rolled past, slowed near my usual pull-off, and then kept going. 20 minutes later, it came back the other way and idled by the neighbor's cattle gate. 2 people climbed out. One headed toward the farmhouse, weapon raised. The other followed the fence line toward my side of the property, moving with a slight limp but good speed. At first, I thought I was looking at another infected. Then I watched the feet. Whoever it was stepped over the low spots instead of dragging through them. When they ducked under a low-hanging branch, they caught it with a hand so it wouldn't whip back. None of the dead things I'd seen cared about noise discipline like that. I eased the rifle to my shoulder and found the figure in the scope. Dark Carhartt jacket, small tactical pack, a hard medical case on a strap at the hip. When the person slipped through a gap in the hedge and stepped into the open field, I saw a face I recognized. Windburned cheeks, tired eyes with dark circles, hair pulled back in a rough ponytail. Months earlier, I had watched her climb out of a mobile vet unit at a farm and stitch up a torn cattle dog while the owner paced in the dirt. Arden Blake. She stopped dead when the stand came fully into view. From where she stood, it was just a strange box on stilts tucked into the trees. She scanned the field, then the trunks, and finally stared hard at the frame, realizing it was built, not grown. I slid the front window open just an inch, enough for my voice to carry but not enough to show my face, and said, "Stay right there and don't come any closer to the legs." She flinched at the sound, spun to face the window, raised both hands away from her gear straps, and said, "Okay, I'm stopped. Weapon is down. Just talk to me before you decide I'm a problem." The pack sat square between her shoulders, heavy with gear. The hard case looked like it held supplies I couldn't scavenge. I kept the rifle low but ready and said, "Arden, right? You ran the clinic by the co-op." She squinted at the dark window, nodded slowly, and answered, "Yeah, you're Gage. Old Chevy truck, good deer racks, same spot every fall. I saw your tire tracks and figured you went high instead of heading back to town." I kept my eyes scanning the hedgerow behind her and asked, "When's the last time you were near someone who wasn't trying to tear your throat out?" She let out a short, sharp breath and said, 2 days. Since then it's been barns, haylofts, and moving fast. None of them are 20 feet off the deck. The field stayed empty around her. Even so, the memory of that stalker standing under my floorboards was fresh. I said, "Ooh, if I let you up here and you're hiding a bite, we both run out of moves fast. I'm not running a hospice." She looked up at the window, her expression flat and serious, and said, If I thought I was turning, I'd be nowhere near another living person. I'd be eating a bullet. I just want a place where my feet aren't on their ground for 5 minutes. I watched her face for another long moment. No glassy stare, no tremors, no strange hyper-focus on my voice. "Drop the pack in that case by the fence," I said. "Walk to the base of the leg with your hands where I can see them." She said, "Got it," and moved with professional efficiency. She slid the pack off, unclipped the hard case, and left them in the tall grass, then walked toward the stand and stopped directly under the hatch line, palms open and raised. I tied off the paracord and lowered the ladder until it touched the dirt beside her. "Climb easy," I said. "If anything moves in the trees, you freeze until I tell you different." She answered, "Fair enough," and started up, testing each rung before committing her weight. When her hands reached the frame, I backed away and pointed at the far corner with the barrel aimed at the floor, not at her, but ready to snap up. She pulled herself inside, took in the room in one glance, and sat where I told her, back to the wall, hands on her knees. I hauled the ladder in, shut the hatch, and dropped the heavy steel bar across it. For a few seconds, we just listened to the wind in the oaks and the faint tick of the cooling stove. Then I said, "Welcome to the penthouse. It's tight, it smells like wood smoke, but it's off the dirt." She gave a tired, humorless laugh and said, "Right now, that sounds like the Hilton." Sharing the stand changed the physics of the room. I had built this box double wide, intending to have extra elbow room for long waits, but with the stove, the gravity-fed water system, and 2 full loadouts of gear, it wasn't exactly a dance floor. We learned the choreography fast. She claimed the corner by the back wall. I held the front. When one of us shifted weight, the other froze and listened, instinctive awareness becoming our new baseline. Once the hatch bar was dropped and locked, I checked her. It wasn't polite, but it was necessary. Arms, neck, hairline, webbing between the fingers behind the ears, then sleeves turned inside out. No bites, no deep lacerations, just old work scars and a fresh, ugly bruise on her hip bone. She watched my hands moving with clinical detachment and said, "You run that like a drill, no hesitation." I answered, "It kind of is now. Hesitation gets you buried." She nodded once, her face grim, and said, "Good. If I slip, if you see the eyes change, don't have a debate with yourself. Just do what you have to do. Put me down before I can stand up." We kept the chatter short and tactical. She had stayed near the dairy farms when the town went dark, running calls in her old vet truck until the roads got choked and the fuel gauge hit empty. In the last week, routine cases had turned into nightmares. Farm dogs turned on their owners without growling. Barn cats clawed their steel cages until their paws were bloody pulps. Cattle slammed into fences until their bones snapped, and the heavy sedatives she used, stuff that should drop a horse, barely slowed them down. Then people started banging on her door, asking her to look at relatives who were acting wrong. She stopped answering house calls. A few days later, the grid died, and the clinic became just another dark box in the middle of nowhere. I briefed her on the threat matrix I'd seen from the stand. The car wreck on the lane, the pack of runners swarming the driver, the stalker that had stood under the legs hunting by the sound of a falling paint chip. Laying it out in a straight line made the picture terrifyingly clear. We weren't dealing with one type of enemy. We had sprinters that chased movement, silent hunters that tracked sound, and something strong enough to rip through livestock like wet paper. We established a simple SOP, standard operating procedure. One person on the glass scanning, one by the stove, boots on, rifle within arm's reach. We spoke in whispers when necessary and left the rest of the time empty so we could read the audio landscape of the field, the creek, and the road. Late that afternoon, a new sound drifted up from the creek bottom, low at first, then rising into a howl that fractured in the middle and scraped back together at the end like metal on stone. We both moved to the window. The creek line cut across the far edge of the property, a dark ribbon of brush and bare cottonwoods. Between 2 trunks, a gray shape stepped into the failing light. It was long and heavy through the shoulders, far too massive for a coyote. "Timberwolf," I whispered. Arden watched it move through her own optic and answered, or a massive coy wolf hybrid. Either way, look at the gait. That's not something you want biting you. It trotted along the bank with its nose glued to the ground. Patches of fur were missing, revealing raw gray skin that sagged in spots and stretched tight in others. When it lifted its head, the jaw hung slightly askew, teeth bared on one side, and one eye was filmed over with milky cataracts. Two more shapes emerged from the brush behind it, then a fourth. A loose, ragged line of gray and brown moved along the creek bank. Their movement was wrong. Some smooth, some jerky like marionettes with tangled strings. One bumped into the flank of another hard enough to knock it off balance. The second animal snapped at the empty air, then fell back into formation like nothing had happened. They didn't move like a healthy pack with a hierarchy. They moved like broken machinery forced to keep running. They followed the creek bed a little farther, then hooked toward the corner where a neighbor used to dump carcass waste during calving season. Nothing lay there now, but the dirt had soaked up a lot of blood over the years. The lead animal stopped, lifted its ruined muzzle, and swung its head toward our stand. For a few seconds, it stood frozen, facing our line of oaks. My knuckles turned white on the rifle stock. Then, with terrifying purpose, it started walking straight toward us, and I checked the stove. The fire was down to coals. No popping, no crackle, no ticking pipe. The stand was as acoustically dead as it was going to get. We stood statue still and watched the gray bodies close the distance. The lead wolf reached the first steel leg and pressed its nose to the metal. It dragged its wet muzzle along the marine paint, sniffed the disturbed dirt at the base where I'd set the ladder, and then moved on. The others spread out under the platform, investigating spots where I had walked, split kindling, or dropped a piece of gear. Arden kept her voice barely above a breath, lips almost touching my ear. "They're tracking residue," she said. "Old scent trails, not just wandering." I answered, "Mine and yours. They know this is a high-traffic area." She said, "If the virus rides them, it rides every line they travel. Fence rows, creeks, drainage ditches, it doesn't care about roadblocks." The lead wolf suddenly snapped its head toward the far fence line, catching a molecule of something on the wind that we couldn't see. Without a bark or a growl, the whole group turned and broke into a run. They hit the far corner with terrifying speed, bodies low and fluid, smashing through the brush and between the barbed wire strands. A few seconds later, we heard the frantic bawl of a cow and the sickening crack of boards giving way. The noise stopped abruptly. No gunshot followed. Either nobody was home at the farmhouse, or nobody made it to their gun cabinet in time. We watched the tree line until the woods went still again. My stomach felt hollowed out. So now we've got fast people, quiet hunters, and apex predators that can carry this to every farm in the county, I said. Arden kept her eyes on the corner and answered, "And everything they bite gets a chance to pass it on. Coyotes, farm dogs, wolves, maybe bear. It won't stay contained in one patch of woods." That night, we rewrote our survival rules. Scent discipline became law. No more bones or food scraps anywhere near the stand. Anything that smelled like a meal went into a triple-sealed bag and was carried to a deep hole a quarter-mile away, on a path we didn't use for anything else. We checked the water barrel fittings. Any drip that hit the dirt created a scent pool that had to be neutralized. We wanted the ground under us to smell like nothing but dead leaves and dirt. Sleep came in short, jagged pieces. Every time a dog barked in the distance and cut off mid-noise, both of us jolted awake, listening for the scrape of claws on steel. Every broken howl drifting up from the creek made the double-thick plywood floor feel paper-thin under our boots. The stand was still our best chance at survival, but the air underneath it now felt like a game trail. And we knew that more than one kind of hunter knew exactly where that trail ended. For 3 days after the wolf pack tore into the neighbor's livestock, the county road remained a ghost town. No tractors rolled down the lane, no mail carrier dusted the weeds, and no distant gunshots cracked the silence. Arden and I rotated shifts at the window, kept the stove choked down to a smokeless simmer, checked our water levels, and moved with the discipline of monks. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt thin and brittle like a sheet of cheap glass waiting for a rock. The shatter came in the form of an engine growl on the gravel. It wasn't a quick drive-by, but a slow, low-gear crawl that got louder and then held steady. I slid to the front window, lifted the corner of the burlap curtain, and watched a dark, lifted pickup roll into view. It was rigged for trouble. Brush guard, light bar, mud tires. 3 men in the cab, one riding in the bed with a scoped rifle across his knees, his head on a swivel scanning the fields. They idled at the neighbor's cattle gate. The front passenger climbed out, walked to the fence post, and studied the dirt like he was reading a map. Even from this distance, I could tell he knew what he was looking for. He pointed once toward our side of the property, once toward the farmhouse, then drew a small circle in the air with his finger. The driver nodded. The truck turned in, tires crunching over the cattle guard, and disappeared behind the hedgerow. Arden moved up beside me, keeping her silhouette away from the open glass, and watched the gap in the trees. "You recognize the rig?" she asked. I kept my eyes locked on the hedgerow and said, "Truck's new to me. Could be locals looking for help, could be scavengers with good taste in suspension." She watched the spot where they had turned and said, "They're not rushing. They're not checking behind them. That's not fear. That's a sector sweep." I tightened my grip on the rifle and answered, "Out here lately, both fear and a sweep get you killed. Let's see which one they brought to the party." A minute later, the pickup slid out into the open strip between the hedgerow and the creek, rolling right up to my old parking spot. The man in the bed jumped down, checked the drainage ditch for infected, and then dropped the tailgate. Another guy climbed out with a pump-action shotgun and walked a slow, lazy half-circle, head up, shoulders loose, like this was just another Saturday morning at the range. "They're shopping," Arden whispered, her voice hard. "Not running, just shopping." I nodded and answered, "They're picking the carcass clean. Looking for anything left they don't have to fight for." One of the men pointed a gloved hand at the stand. The others glanced up at the steel legs, saw no ladder, no smoke, and no movement, and lost interest. To them, it was just an empty deer blind, probably stripped seasons ago. They went for my truck instead. 2 of them pried at the camper shell until the lock popped with a snap and started hauling gear onto the gravel. A cooler, a spare fuel can, a heavy tool bag, and a box of waterfowl shells I had left behind because I couldn't carry everything up the ladder in one trip. Anything useful went into their bed. The rest, seat covers, old maps, trash, they kicked into the weeds. Arden's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped in her cheek. "That's your gear," she said. "It's enough of it," I answered, feeling the burn in my gut. "Stuff I hoped would still be there next month, but nothing I'm willing to die for today." She watched them toss my toolbox and asked, "You want to make this a problem?" "We have the angle." I shook my head and said, "If I open up from here, we drop maybe 2. Then we get a firefight with the other 2 who know exactly where we sleep. Plus we ring the dinner bell for every runner within 3 miles. That's not a win. That's a suicide pact." She let out a slow, controlled breath and said, "Then we stay quiet and memorize their faces." When they were done stripping the truck, the man from the gate, the tracker, walked toward the hedgerow where my oldest foot trail cut through the grass. He scraped the dirt with his boot, followed the faint depression in the weeds with his eyes, and then looked up toward our strip of oaks. He couldn't see the ladder, but he could read the ground. He saw the compression in the soil that said people used this corner recently. His hand came up and pointed straight at our trees. "That one's the problem," Arden said. "He knows someone likes this patch." I said, "And he wants to see how much." He walked into the field, turned once to scan the creek and the fences for threats, and then headed straight for the stand, walking with a confidence that made my skin crawl. I stepped back from the window and shouldered the rifle. Arden checked the hatch bar, ensured it was seated, and dropped to one knee beside the opening, pistol drawn. Boots crunched under the frame. He stopped at the base of a leg, looked up and shaded his eyes against the gray sky. From where he stood, the stand was a dark, impregnable box with no easy way up. From where I stood, he was one trigger pull away from never getting back to his truck. He called out, his voice steady and projecting well. "Anybody up there?" There was no edge to it, no panic. Just a man testing the air temperature. I stayed quiet, letting the wind do the talking. Arden watched him through a thin crack in the floorboards and gave a small negative shake of her head. He waited a few seconds, kicked the steel leg lightly, and then said, "If you're up there, we're not hunting you. We're just looking to trade and move on. No drama." His people were still standing in the mess they had made in the bed of my truck when he used the word trade. I let the silence hang for a long 10 count, then spoke, my voice loud enough to be heard but calm. "Stay off the legs and keep your hands off my rig." The sound carried clean in the still air. He didn't jump. He stepped back a pace, hands coming up to chest height, palms out, showing he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He turned his head toward the lane and shouted, "Ease up on his truck, boys. He's awake and he's home." The two at my truck went still and looked our way. One raised his shotgun halfway, an instinctive move, then set it back on the tailgate like he wanted us to see him disarming. The driver stayed in the cab, engine idling. I kept the rifle low, muzzle pointed at the floor by my boot but ready to swing, and said, "You've already taken your cut. Call the toolbox and the fuel payment for staying out of these trees." He tilted his head, squinting up at the plywood, and asked, "You planning to live in that box, friend?" I answered, "I'm planning to stay off the dirt as long as the dirt keeps trying to eat people. That's as far as the plan goes." He gave the stand a long, flat look, calculating the angles, the height, and the lack of a ladder. He said, "We're running the back roads, checking spots people walked away from fast. Some of us hunted this county before all this went sideways. We know the good corners. Good corners usually have stuff," Arden whispered. "He just filed us under stuff," I said quietly. "Yeah. Guy in a fortified stand with enough gear to watch us steal and not come down. That's the story he'll tell his crew tonight." The man let out a short breath, nodded once, and said louder, "Could be we never see each other again. Could be we do. Either way, now we know you're up there. Stay safe." Then he turned his back, a calculated insult or a show of confidence, and walked back to the truck. They didn't point guns at us as they left. They didn't apologize. They tossed the cooler, the fuel can, and the ammo box into their bed, slammed the tailgate shut, and rolled out the way they came, slow and steady, like they had all the time in the world. Dust hung over the lane long after the sound of the diesel engine faded. We watched the break in the hedgerow until it was just brush again. The anger in my chest burned hot and then cooled into a hard knot of worry. Arden holstered her pistol and said, "To them, this isn't a home. It's a stash they couldn't crack today." I nodded and answered, "And stash is a word people remember when the easy places are empty." That night, we rewrote our engagement rules. Any engine on the gravel put one of us at the window with a rifle and the other at the hatch with the floor clear. We filled extra water jugs and stashed them by the legs, not for drinking, but in case somebody tried to smoke us out with fire. The infected were dangerous because they never stopped. People were dangerous because they learned, and now at least 4 of them knew there was something worth learning up here. The raiders in the lift kit pickup never came back, but they left a ghost behind. The memory of them stayed in the stand like a bad smell. Anytime an engine echoed off the hills, I went to the front window with the rifle, and Arden went to the hatch with her boots on and her pistol drawn. Most days, the noise was just a tractor working a field 3 miles away or the wind playing tricks in the drainage pipes. We treated every sound like it was the opening note of an ambush. The box had heat, water, and food, but we knew that comfort was dangerous. It made you soft. So we didn't relax. Days slid by in a blur of paranoia until a new sound cut through the routine. I was stacking short pieces of split oak near the stove when a rhythmic ringing drifted across the field. It wasn't the growl of an engine, the crack of a gunshot, or the wet, tearing sounds the infected made. It was metal striking metal, hollow, steady, and deliberate, like a hammer on steel. Arden looked up from the notebook where she tracked our calorie counts and said, "You hear that? That's rhythmic." I stopped moving and listened again. Clank. Pause. Clank. "Yeah," I answered. "That's someone working, not fighting or running." She frowned toward the far fence line and asked, "Do we ignore it, or do we check it before they break something that matters to us?" The sound lined up in my head with the old utility pole at the edge of the property, one of the last ones that had still hummed before the grid went down for good. We didn't know how long any residual power would last, but if somebody was out there cutting lines for copper scrap, I wanted to see who it was. I said, "I'll go look. You stay on the glass. If you see me wave twice, open the hatch when I come back. If you see me drop, or if I sprint for the trees, you pull the ladder up and forget you ever knew my name." She held my eyes for a second, her face hard, and said, "Fine. Just don't make me prove I can actually do that." I lowered the ladder, scanned the road, and moved along the hedgerow with the shotgun, keeping to the shadows. The ringing grew clearer with each step. At a gap in the windbreak, I saw him. One man in a faded high-vis work jacket was halfway up the pole, his climbing belt holding him leaning back, a heavy tool bag hanging below his boots. A hunting rifle was tied across his back with paracord so it wouldn't swing while he worked. He heard my boots in the stubble before he saw me, a pro, not a tourist. His hand frozen mid-swing with a wrench. He turned his head, spotted the shotgun leveled at him, and called down, "If you're going to shoot me, do it while I'm looking at you, or let me unhook so I don't hang here like a side of beef." His voice sounded worn out like gravel in a mixer, but not afraid. I stopped 10 yards back where he could see my hands and said, "If I was going to shoot you, I'd have done it while you were facing the pole. Come down. Slow." He snorted once, answered, "Fair point," and then loosened his strap. He descended in short, practiced drops, his boot gaffs digging into the wood. Up close, I saw a utility company logo half rubbed off his jacket. His face was lean, eyes ringed with exhaustion but clear and focused. He stayed one step back from his landing spot, palms open, and said, "Name's Jonah Kade. Used to work this line for the county before everything went sideways. I'm trying to pull a few components, breakers, wire, for my own setup. You live out here, or did I just step on somebody's last quiet patch of ground?" I kept the barrel low but ready and said, "I live higher than you think. That pole feeds the last line on this property. I wanted to see if you were stripping copper or fixing circuits." He glanced toward the oaks where my stand was hidden and said, "Makes sense. I'm not cutting anything live if I can help it. I'm scavenging. Panels, batteries, charge controllers. Out here, power isn't just luxury, it's heat and information." When I asked if he was alone, he shook his head and said his old crew had gone to the FEMA shelters in the city. He chose distance and trees. Wounds came before trust. "When's the last time you let anything get close enough to grab you?" I asked. He didn't argue. He rolled up his sleeves, showed his hands, and tugged his collar aside so I could see his neck and shoulders. I saw rope burns and old work scars, but no teeth marks. "If I thought I was turning," he said, looking me dead in the eye, "I wouldn't walk toward another person. I'd pick a drainage ditch and eat my own gun." I thought about the nights Arden and I had split into exhausting 4-hour watches. I looked at his gear, the tools, the knowledge. "I've got a vet tech up there already," I said. "She knows sick from dead. You come up, she checks you again. You pull your weight, you stay. You start trouble, you go back to walking the road." He gave a small shrug, looked at the darkening sky, and said, "Better odds than I had on that pole. Lead on." We walked back along the hedge, stopped twice to clear our tails, and then I whistled the signal under the stand. Arden slid the hatch open just enough to see us, her rifle barrel poking out like a black finger. I called up, "Lineman, knows the grid, checked for bites." She hesitated, then pulled the bar back and let us bring him up under the muzzle. Inside, the stand shrank immediately around 3 people. Even with the double-wide floor, it was intimate. But as Jonah looked around at the stove and the layout, I saw the calculation in his eyes. The rules stayed simple. No secrets about wounds, no stealing from the food bins, and every round fired had to be worth the noise it made. Jonah didn't waste time with pleasantries once he saw how we were living. He stood in the center of the cramped floor, auditing the space like a building inspector. He took in the cast iron stove, the gravity-fed water barrel, the hammocks slung diagonally and the hooks loaded with gear. Then he leaned toward the front window, studying the sway of the oak branches against the gray sky. He told us we'd done solid work with wood and buckets, but if we wanted this box to be more than a temporary coffin, we needed electricity. Not a lot, just enough to keep the darkness pushed back. I had a meager setup, one folding solar panel meant for charging phones, a couple of deep cycle batteries that had seen better days, and a bag of cheap LED flashlights. Arden had a hand-crank emergency radio and 2 headlamps that were running on fumes. Jonah spread the gear out on the plywood floor, sorting the junk from the gold. He pushed the cheap plastic aside, kept the best 12-volt battery and the largest panel, and said, "We have the parts for a trickle system. 1 decent panel, 1 battery that can hold a charge, short wires to reduce resistance, and strict rules. We run an energy budget now. If we draw too much, we kill the battery and we go dark for good." We set the protocols before he stripped the first wire. No bright white light outside the stand, ever. No light at all on the ground level. Nothing strong enough to leak through the cracks in the plywood walls. Power was for information, radios, for low-vis lighting, and for keeping rechargeable batteries topped off. It was a lifeline, not a luxury. There was a sturdy oak a few yards away that leaned slightly toward our tree. Jonah watched its canopy sway in the wind and noted that it moved in sync with ours, meaning a cable strung between them wouldn't snap in a gust. He took the removable ladder in short, tactical hops, clipping his lineman's safety lanyard to the tree whenever his boots left the rungs. He spent an hour up there with a handsaw, carefully pruning only the dead branches that would shade the panel or risk falling on it during a storm. Every crack of dry wood snapping sounded like a gunshot to us, making us freeze and scan the fields for movement. He built a simple rugged frame on the neighboring oak and bolted the panel to it, tilting it perfectly to catch the low arc of the autumn sun. From the lane, it was invisible, just a dark rectangular shadow against the bark. A short insulated cable ran along a high branch, dropped down one of the steel legs, and entered the stand through a small hole he drilled above the stove. Inside, he screwed a small charge controller to a scrap of 2x4 and tied it to the battery, crimping every connection and sealing them with heat shrink tubing until nothing could rattle loose. Arden watched him work and said, "You're acting like a foreman is going to hike out here and fail us on a code inspection." Jonah didn't look up from the terminal he was tightening. He answered, "Lazy wiring causes shorts. Shorts cause sparks. Sparks cause fires. I'd rather not have to climb down from a burning tree into a field full of things that want to eat me." When he closed the final circuit breaker, a small green LED on the controller blinked to life. The panel was feeding the battery. We had juice. We tested one headlamp on the lowest setting. The battery gauge barely moved. Jonah warned us that the short winter days and overcast skies wouldn't give us much amperage, but a steady trickle would keep the radio alive and let us run a couple of interior lights without draining the system flat. He took a permanent marker and wrote the load order on the wall beside the controller. Radios first, headlamps second. Nothing else unless the vote is unanimous. The radio got a dedicated shelf by the front window. Jonah ran a simple wire antenna out through a gap in the siding and grounded the system to the steel legs of the stand to cut down on static interference. When I asked if grounding really mattered when the grid was dead, he said, "Lightning doesn't care if the electric bill got paid. If we're the highest point in this field, we give the surge somewhere to go that isn't through our chests." With steady power and a cleaner signal, the radio band changed. The old recorded government alert still looped on one channel, sounding more ghostly every day. But under the static, we found the survivors. Ham operators and truckers were trading information on the open bands. Some calls were just panicked, breathless bursts that died mid-sentence. Others were calm, flat voices trading road numbers and warning about blocked bridges, burned-out towns, or stretches of highway packed with fast movers. None of them offered a safe harbor, but they drew lines on the mental map in my head, telling us exactly where not to go. Night watch transformed. Before, whoever was on duty sat next to a lantern turned so low it was useless for anything but company. Now we clipped a small red LED lamp near the window, aimed at the floor. The red light preserved our night vision and didn't travel far, but it was bright enough to see a rifle chamber, a logbook entry, and the radio dial. From the outside, the stand still looked dead and abandoned. From the inside, we could move and work without stepping on each other in the pitch black. Jonah hunted down noise with the same obsession he applied to the wiring. He wrapped the ladder rope in old rags where it touched the wood so it wouldn't slap in the wind. He glued bits of rubber tire under the metal hook so hanging gear wouldn't click. He showed us how to hang pots and tools so they didn't swing and chime when the tree shifted in a gale. It was simple work, but it made the box feel less like a rattling death trap and more like a tactical operations center. In the evenings, we sat on the floor while the radio murmured low in the corner. Arden checked our first aid supplies and made lists of what we couldn't replace. Antibiotics, sutures, painkillers. Jonah kept a log of how much charge the panel pulled in versus how much we burned. I watched the darkening fields and listened to the wind. For the first time, planning felt like strategy, not just guessing. One clear afternoon with the stove cold and the battery topped off at 100%, Jonah looked around the stand and said, "You've got a good setup here, Gage. Heat, water, power, beds, it's tight, but it works. But it's still just one tree. One bad windstorm, one lightning strike, or one fire, and we're back on the ground with everybody else." Arden looked up from her book and asked, "So what, we made a mistake building this?" He shook his head and said, "No. You picked the only smart option you had. I'm just saying this should be your first high spot, not your last. We need redundancy." We followed his gaze out the window. The same patchwork of fields and hedgerows I had hunted for 20 years now looked like a map of potential outposts, a massive oak overlooking the creek bend. A thick cedar grove by the far fence line, the skeleton of a grain elevator over a collapsed barn a mile away. None of them were ready, but all of them were higher than the slaughterhouse on the ground. The small panel on the oak and the quiet battery on our wall gave us more than just light and radio chatter. They gave us the time to think about a second location before the world decided to test the first one to its breaking point. The first real stress test of our fortress came on a night that felt deceptively normal. The air was still, the sky clear, and a faint amber glow from some burning town lingered on the horizon. Before dark, we ran the standard readiness checklist. Water topped off, wood staged, ammo counted, battery showing green. Rifles were loaded with rounds chambered but safeties on. The shotgun sat by the hatch, pistols were on belts. Arden took the first watch. I climbed into the hammock to catch a few hours. Jonah stretched out on his pad by the stove, the quiet shattered not long after full dark. 2 fast taps on the wall brought us all to combat readiness instantly. I slid to the window slit and saw headlights cutting through the gloom on the gravel road before they swung aggressively toward the neighbor's farm. High beams swept the dead fields, pinning the farmhouse and barn in blinding white light. Engines cut, doors slammed, and shouting erupted. A dozen men, maybe more, spilled into the yard armed with rifles, bats, and pipe wrenches. They kicked in the barn door, smashed the front windows of the house, and drifted toward the back fence that pointed straight at our line of oaks. The first howl from the creek bottom changed the entire frequency of the night. Another answered it immediately, closer, then 2 more from the drainage ditch. One of the raiders tried to laugh it off and fired a warning shot straight up into the air. The crack rolled across the flat fields like a whip. The wolves answered with a broken, discordant chorus that made the floorboards under us vibrate. A moment later, runners poured out of the roadside ditch at a full sprint while gray, loping bodies slid from the creek bank into the other side of the yard. Wolves and fast infected hit the group from both flanks simultaneously, and the neat line of raiders dissolved into a chaotic churn of limbs, teeth, and muzzle flashes. A handful of the raiders broke away from the slaughter and ran blindly for our trees, glancing up at the stand like it was the last dry rock in a rising flood. Bitten or not, they were a fatal problem. If they reached the steel legs and started screaming for help, they would drag half the field directly to our ladder. "Controlled fire only," I whispered, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Don't be a hero, protect the nest." Arden didn't look away from her sector. Jonah moved to the hatch, racked the shotgun slide, and said, "If someone grabs a rung, I'm not asking for a vote." The first man stumbled into our clearing, his jacket shredded and mouth hanging open in terror, eyes locked on the box. He might have still been human. He might not. We didn't have the luxury of finding out. I waited for a gap in the noise, exhaled, and put one round center mass. He dropped in a heap 10 yards short of the legs. Behind him, another figure crawled through the mud with a shattered leg until a wolf hit him from the blind side and dragged him back toward the hedge. In the strobe light effect of the muzzle flashes, I picked out one shape that moved differently from the rest. It walked instead of ran, its head tilting toward each scream, triangulating. A stalker feeling its way through the cacophony. Suddenly, one of the dying raiders pointed a bloody hand at us and screamed, "Fort! There's a fort in the trees!" The stalker's head snapped in our direction instantly. 2 runners and a limping wolf turned with it. "Time to be furniture," Jonah hissed and killed the red floor lamp. Arden and I slid back from the windows, leaving only a hairline slit to watch the legs. The stand went dead. No light, no talking, no breathing. Feet pounded the dirt directly under us. One body slammed into a steel leg hard enough to make the floor jump. Fingers scraped against the metal, slipped and scraped again. The stalker reached the base, stopped and tilted its head, listening for a heartbeat while the wolf limped in circles beside it. We didn't move. My shoulder burned from holding the rifle shouldered for so long. Cold sweat ran down my spine. Any shot now, even a cough, would prove there was life on top of the steel. The raiders, in their panic, saved us without meaning to. One of them emptied a magazine in a wild, full-auto arc at the pack. Another screamed as the infected breached the barn. The fresh, violent noise swung the attention back toward the farmyard. The stalker turned its head toward the louder sound. The runners peeled off to join the chase. The wolf staggered after the promise of easier blood. The chaos burned down fast after that. Screams thinned out. Gunshots spaced out and then stopped. The engines coughed and went quiet. We waited in the absolute dark until the steel legs felt like cold metal again, and not like conductors for death. Finally, Jonah tapped the floor twice and whispered, "Count to 60, then we look." At 60, I eased forward and checked the field. The farmyard was a dark smear of bodies. One truck was burning slowly, throwing a greasy orange stain onto the low clouds. Our field held 2 still shapes that had almost made it to the legs. Nothing moved under our tree. The wolves and runners had chased the retreating meat into the dark. Arden let out a long, shuddering breath and said, "They saw us. They pointed us out and we're still up here." I nodded in the dark and answered, we got lucky. We stayed quiet and they made mistakes, that's it." Jonah pushed himself up, rubbing his bad knee, and said, "And that's exactly why this can't be our only plan. 1 tree, 1 box, 1 bad break away from the dirt. We need more." We went down the next day at first light, fast and focused. We buried what needed burying to kill the scent, dragged anything bloody far away from the legs into the deep woods, and checked every brace, strap, and bolt on the stand. That night, with the stove ticking comfortably and the radio whispering about cities we were never going to see again, Jonah spread his rough map on the floor. He marked our stand with an X, then tapped 3 other high spots along the ridge and over the creek. Arden watched his pen move and said, "So we build more nests." A network. I looked at the marks on the paper and then at the hatch bar that locked us in. "The ground belongs to them now," I said. "So we stopped living on it. 1 stand kept us alive this week. A few more might give us something you can actually call a life." If you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.